Hey, welcome to our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for tonight, Wednesday, September 17th, with the great Dan Levitt. Dan will be talking about John McGraw's land fiasco. And if you remember way back, Dan also has spoken on here a couple of times, and he had an award-winning book, Intentional Balk. Before we turn it over to Dan, just want to go over a few things to all the Jewish people out there. Happy New Year. Uh,
Yay.
Next week we're back on our Thursday meetings with Tom Ross. Tom is an artist from New Mexico, and many years back he made these placards of Willie Mays's The Catch, and he pasted it. He put them at the Polo Grounds and then in Central Park. Uh, and next week he's speaking on the 25th, and the 29th was 71 years ago. Willie made that catch. I sent out some things regarding the Polo Grounds. We got some nice press coverage. Um, and this Sunday, there might be an article about us in Phil Mushnick's column in the New York Post. I also spoke to the president of the Polo Ground Towers, and they mentioned about possibly having some statues there of Willie Mays, renaming the community center. And also, they're working on getting that sign fixed that said, keep this area beautiful. Willie Mays played here. I re-upped with Zoom. The bill has been paid, so we're good for another year. And before we turn it over to Dan, I want to reintroduce Amy and Bill Swisher. Bill, as you know, was the man behind getting a marker placed at where John McGraw played in Truxton, New York. And he is now working on Plan B. And Bill is going to talk for a couple of minutes. I thought it was appropriate. I got Dan's permission because they're both talking about the same guy, John McGraw. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, we had a very successful event on August the 2nd where we placed the historic marker uh, concerning the baseball game that was played there in 1938. As was mentioned, we are attempting to do restoring with the grandstand that you see behind me. Amy and I went over there today and looked at it more closely, and from a distance, it looks okay. But when you get close to it, it needs a lot of work done in order to restore it, preserve it for a long period of time. So at the present time, we are attempting to raise some money through donations, through grants, through various things to restore that grandstand to its mighty good times, and we hope we were able to do that in the next year. So that's the third spot. I hope I live long enough to see it happen.
Well, we expect you here next year to have a full program to talk about what has been transpiring there, okay?
Hey, Gary,
Yes, Paul.
just a suggestion for him. He might want to, if he's trying to encourage people, even whether it's donating money or doing the work, would reach out to the International Brotherhood of Carpenters or the iron workers in his area, the Labor Federation in his area, or Labor Council, and see if he can get some support for work for that.
Great suggestion.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Well, Bill, we wish you the best, and once you get everything finalized, feel free to send us whatever form you might have asking for donations. You never know who might have some extra money in their pockets. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Before I turn it over, Dan, Steve, 15
Yeah,
seconds.
I'm going to make it quick, and you can never say this enough. We take for granted these meetings every week, and most of us have a really, really good time. What went on in Harlem a week and a half ago, and I'm not saying it was Gary directly to restore that plaque and whatever else is going on, but you know what? Without Gary's push, none of that would have happened. So
Thank you, Steve.
kudos to Gary for that. And,
Absolutely.
keep it strong, Gary. And
Thank you,
Walker is
Steve.
definitely your guy.
Very, very kind of you. Okay. I'd like to reintroduce Dan Levitt to the New York Giants Preservation Society. Dan, the floor is yours. And before, Dan, you talk about your main topic tonight, why don't you tell everybody the project you're working on so that we'll have you back in a few years again. And you're mute. There you go.
All right. So I'm working on a biography of McGraw. Through all of my writing over the years, McGraw just always seemed to come up central to pretty much any story between about 1890 and 1930. And I had so much material on him, and I've continued to gather it. So I am working on a biography of McGraw. The University of Nebraska has agreed to publish it. I have to turn it in by the end of March of 27, which seemed like it was a long time when I signed the contract. It seems like that date is getting closer and closer, and I'm not getting as far along as I'd like. And then, assuming that it's the year to publish, takes a year to publish, I'm hoping that's sort of out for the season in 28, which again feels like it's a long way away, but I'm guessing it's going to be here sooner than I think, is when the book should theoretically be released.
I got two things to ask you before you turn over your program. Working title again for everybody?
The working title right now is the Little Napoleon, the tumultuous life and times of John McGraw. I kind of like the idea of the book because, obviously McGraw is just an incredibly interesting character, but he was also at the center of sort of everything going on in baseball. And plus he was such a big celebrity in New York, so there was, he was stumping for Jimmy Walker for mayor. He was trying to start an oil company in Texas. He was selling mining stocks. He was trying to sell mining stocks in 1907. I mean, he was just in the middle of all of the various American events. There was John McGraw sort of standing in the middle of them.
Wonderful. And the last thing, just to throw out at you, there have been other biographies written. How will this one differ in your mind?
I think, obviously the Charles Alexander one from 1988 is sort of the definitive one. And if you just look at how much stuff happened since 1988 in terms of baseball research, it's just incredible. You look at like the SABR bio project, and there's probably bios of 200 people who played for McGraw, and all their stories are out there. And then there's just lots of other stuff, like the story I'm talking tonight about Pennant Park, spending time down in the Bradenton, Manatee County Historical Society and the office, the records office, just going through stuff. There's just, the amount of stuff that's been done in the last 40 years is just tremendous.
All right, wonderful. We're going to turn the program over now fully to Dan. I'm going to give him the screen. If you don't know, Dan is sorry, Dan, a big shot in SABR, because you are. Okay, so there you go.
All right,
Dan.
yeah, and I encourage everybody who's not a member to join. I think a large part of this group probably is. So
there you go, Dan. Floor's yours. Let's all give it up for Dan Levitt.
Thank you. All right, let me see if I can share this correctly. All right. Okay, is it working?
Yep.
All right. So let me just start by saying that the Florida land boom and bust of the 1920s was one of the epic events in America's cultural, economic, and demographic history. People were streaming to Florida, and they were bringing their money with them. The bust, when it came, was equally tumultuous, dislocating the lives of many Americans. John McGraw, who was manager of the New York Giants, as we've just been talking about, was one of baseball's and New York's biggest celebrities, and he suffered more than anyone. This is that story. So let's jump into the slides here. All right, so after World War I, there was a short recession, and then there was this massive boom in terms of GDP and just growth and opportunities. And this post-war prosperity, there was also this feeling that there was just an investment opportunity out there. There was this zeitgeist that if you knew where to invest, if you knew where to go, there would be a whole lot of money waiting for you. And what really captured America at the time was Florida land. And there was a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, there was a lot of irrationality to it, as there is with any boom and bust. But there was also a lot of reasons to think that the Florida land had some sort of reason to go up in price. First of all, there was the recent transportation infrastructure. There were steamship lines to both coasts. There were now railroad lines down both coasts. There had been a lot of roads that had been built, and so that you could drive from the Midwest or the Northeast to Florida in a week instead of a month. And there was also this enormous marketing campaign. So you had a lot of big landowners that had acquired land over the years, and they made a huge push in newspapers throughout the US, hyping Florida land and the weather and all the opportunities. There was quasi-governmental agencies that were doing stuff. The chambers of commerce were very active doing advertising. So there was this enormous push to try and get people to come down. And then, of course, like for any boom, there were stories of successes. So in 1919, Miami Beach, really Carl Fisher, that's really when he started Miami Beach. Coral Gables was 1921. And these had a lot of success in selling. There was also a lot on the west coast of Florida, which is where McGraw was on the west coast. So both sides, there were stories of successes. And then there was just this massive boom. And you can just see this advertisement from 1925, the greatest real estate development in the world. All right, so McGraw had long wanted to cash in on some sort of big business. He obviously loved being a baseball manager, but he always had other dreams. Even in Baltimore, when he was a player in his 20s, he and Wilbert Robinson owned a sports bar, and really one of the first sort of large sports bars in the country. He had another sports bar, a gambling hall, when he moved to New York in 1907. As I mentioned earlier, he tried to sell California mining stocks. He had been out in California for spring training. He came back and he decided that he was going to try and get into the mining stock business on the side. So anyway, he was friends with John Ringling of Ringling Circus. Ringling himself was trying to do a bunch of development in Sarasota on the west coast of Florida. And he talked McGraw into moving spring training over there in 1924. McGraw was very comfortable and knew a lot about Florida. He went to Cuba every winter and would spend time in Florida both before and after going to Cuba. Now, McGraw basically knew everybody in New York. That was sort of who McGraw was. And one of the people he knew was a guy named E. Phocion Howard. And if Phocion Howard didn't exist, somebody probably would have invented him. He owned the New York Press, which was a weekly sporting paper. He was friends with pretty much all of the Broadway folks and also anybody in the underworld. Howard, like McGraw, knew everybody. And Westbrook Pegler had a great comment about Howard, about Howard, which I will just read here. He often wore a purple suit and purple tie with a pink shirt and collar and ruby studs and links. This combination with his white spats, white hat, and gold-headed stick he used as his morning costume. When he was really dressed up, he sometimes went in for effects that were almost gaudy. Pegler could write, huh? I mean, but anyway, Howard had grown up in Chicago. His dad was moved to Washington as a foreign correspondent or U.S. correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. Howard went with him, took a job in the Congress working as a page, and just realized there was so much corruption in Washington. He was going to be corrupt himself, and he sort of became sort of this gentleman swindler, if you will, selling mining stocks, oil stocks, and other things that didn't really have any money to him, but sort of in this whole gentleman way that we kind of think of the friendly swindler. So anyway, he knew a couple of guys in Chicago named Louis Polikow and Israel Perlman who were sort of real estate sharpies and had real estate in Florida, had bought and sold it, and knew of a site, which I'm going to show you in a minute, on the west coast of Florida. And Howard actually invested money with him and lost money too. So it wasn't really a swindle. Polikow and Perlman, it's hard to know at this date exactly what was going on there, but they introduced McGraw to a site, and McGraw put in his initial investment was only $5,000. He raised money from a lot of his gambling buddies and horse racing buddies, like Tim Mara, the owner of the Giants, was an early investor, and a number of other folks. Whitey Beck, just sort of the New York gambling, not necessarily the underworld, but the gambling establishment. So here's the site for those of you who know West Florida a little bit. So it's between Bradenton and Sarasota, right across from Longboat Key. The total is about 1,500 acres, and you can see a little bit closer here on the right. Today, what's sort of fascinating, just not to cut to the end, but the western side of this, except for on the water, is still undeveloped. To the eastern side is now where the IMG Academy is. Nick Bollettieri started the tennis camp there. It's now where they train baseball and soccer, and it's one of these high-end youth training facilities is what's on the eastern end. So Mcgraw'S group paid an enormous, exorbitant amount for the site. So this is just an example. So these records, I went through the records at the Manatee County Courthouse with the fellow who worked there who was actually having fun doing this with me because, you know, this was a lot more fun, I think, than whatever you do in filing records. So in 1924, the project sold, the site sold for $20,500 with $3,500 down, which is pretty typical. About 10 to 15% to 20% down is what's typical. And as you can see, over the year up until 1925, it basically went up about 40 times in 20 times in price, 40 times overall to what Mcgraw'S group ended up paying for it, which was in February 26th. That's when it was recorded. The actual purchase was in about November as part of this story. So there's just this massive bump in these land prices, and you can see not a lot's being paid down. And again, these totals are never really being paid. That's the other key to this. This was going on throughout Florida, is that these things would be flipped. So there'd be this contract where someone paid $3,500 down and had the right to buy the property for $20,500. They would then sell that contract to somebody who would pay them $12,000 and then have this $82,000 that they were eventually going to have to pay. So these contracts are just being flipped, and the actual principal was never being paid. Well, this would have worked. This might have worked, except for if you go back, you can see that in the little blue there, they had no water frontage. So Mcgraw'S first piece, whatever he bought, this group didn't realize that they had no frontage on the water. They just had like that little 1 mile little strip down there in the corner in blue. So they bought the piece that was directly to the west. And as you can see, it's another piece that just had these massive, another 10 times increase in price since the beginning of since August of 1924. But here, not to help him, but I mean, he only had to pay $50,000 down. So you can see that Mcgraw'S group had at this point, sort of now in about just late November 1924 or 1925, excuse me, they had $250,000 down, but they were going to owe, close to $1.7 million for the rest of over the next several years. So they were taking on a gigantic obligation. There were more problems than just how much money they were paying. The site was completely raw. So this is an aerial from about 1940, and this is just scrubland. There's nothing there at all. And so you're going to have, as we'll talk, you're just going to have this massive infrastructure putting in roads, not just within the park itself, but to get there was going to be crazy. It was at least a mile from Highway 41 was to the east, Tamiami Trail, and then north of it is Cortez Road. Again, for those of you might know the area. And you're going to have to not only build out the roads internally, but you're going to have to build out a road system and sewers and everything else to get you to the major arterials nearby. So they had this grand design for the park. I mean, not surprisingly, right? It was nearly 1,500 acres between the two sites. Just the initial site, the one that first one I showed that didn't have really any water frontage, was going to have 5,000 residential lots, and there's probably going to be about 3,000 on the second one. There was this ambitious business district. There was going to be circular streets. They were going to sell off pieces for office buildings. Really, cool amenities. Anyone who bought a house in Pennant Park, was going to get a yacht, was going to get access to this yacht club, golf course, ball fields. And McGraw, who had done spring training in 1924 and 1925 in Sarasota, was going to move spring training to this park in 1927 after he had built a ballpark. He was naming streets, after ball players, actors, business tycoons. The main road through the park, he was named after Christy Mathewson. Mathewson had just died in early October in 1925. And so that was going to be the main road. And obviously, since it's always good to be in with the commissioner, I don't know if you can see down below, but the road right, the road right along the bay there, that's named after Judge Landis. So, always good to get in with the commissioner. Started marketing this in November of 1925. And I think that one of the more interesting parts of this whole story is that, and I'll get into this later, I think McGraw was going to give up managing. He was going to move down here to Sarasota, which was just south, and he was going to be sort of like the kingpin of this massive 1,500 acre development, the same way other folks were kingpins in Coral Gables or on Miami Beach. This was his project. This was his retirement. He had just won 4 pennants in a row, and he had done everything he wanted to do in baseball. And he said he was moving down here. In fact, there was in the papers that he was selling his house up in New York. So the lots were going to range from about $2,000 to $15,000, depending on where you were in the park. These are another picture of the park. There was about a $20 million retail value if you assume, just on that first piece, if you take an average of $4,000 a lot, that means there's a $20 million retail value, which if you can sell everything out, that works. You can make some money even at these gigantic costs that he had. It was estimated it was going to be about $750 to finish out a lot. So that's close to another $4 million. And then, of course, there was these massive infrastructure costs, which I talk about, your roads and sewer and water. I mean, all of this was going to cost a lot too. So if you didn't sell these lots really, really quickly, and when you realize that the total population of the whole county was about 30,000, you could see that you were going to have to pretty much get everybody who was moving into West Florida to move here, and they were going to have to buy lots really quickly. And just to give some sense of proportion, the average home in the 20s cost about $6,000 to $8,000. And so in the average cost of these homes, the cost themselves outside of the lot was anywhere from $6,000 to $40,000. So the cheapest house here would have probably been $8,000 and, up anywhere to $50,000, which bought you a really, really nice house in 1920. So this was upper end with a yacht club and golf courses and everything else that you'd expect. So McGraw's started marketing this property right away. He hired a marketing team and recruited salesmen throughout the U.S. This is just an ad from the St. Louis paper. I mean, they were doing this everywhere. This was in every paper in the country looking for sales folks. They opened throughout the U.S. And I'm talking about in New York that they were going to have 50 salespeople in New York. McGraw recruited ball players to help him market. Some retired, some at current. He had Ivy Olson, the shortstop up in Brooklyn, doing a bunch of marketing. Chick Fuster was in Baltimore. Pitcher Rosie Ryan, who I think was from Boston, was up there marketing. He had Dutch Ruther in Washington. So a lot of these players were helping market this project to try and earn, and they were, to earn sales commissions. This was a profitable thing. They sell lots. They were making sales commissions. And they allocated about $250,000 to the marketing campaign, which was a huge amount of money for marketing in the 1920s. So they were also taking out ads in papers as part of this huge marketing campaign. The one on the left is from a Sarasota paper in November 30th, really one of their first big marketing pushes. And I'm just going to read some of this copy here, which is hard to read, but I think is important to understand sort of just how grandiose the promises and the plans were. Here in Florida, I am personally going to live. When my ball teams are forgotten, Pennant Park will remain a thing of beauty where people will find happiness and pleasure. I frankly believe the public demand will exhaust the supply and that early purchasers, those who do it now, and do it now as in caps, will be the chief financial beneficiaries. I want you to join me because the price of home sites in Pennant Park will go skyrocketing, like tickets for the World Series or the Army-Navy game. Let us select a home site for you at Pennant Park. And this is kind of the key part. I mean, in the ad, as yet, I have neither literature nor maps, nor plats, nor anything save Pennant Park and unbounded faith in the future. You too must have faith, faith in me and vision. So at this point, I mean, other than these maps that I have showing you on some of these slides, there was nothing. There was no plans. There was no sewer plan. There was no road plan in any detail. I mean, it was just sort of platted out there, and he had to hope he was going to sell these. Again, he had a whole lot of investors who were with him, and they had to. But this was a real sort of McGraw believed in it because he believed he could do anything. But as you can see, this was just going to be very hard to deliver on in any economy. The middle letter here, I love this letter. It's a miscellaneous salesperson sending a letter to Gary Herman. Gary Herman, back before 1920, had been the head of the National Commission, which was then the ruling body over baseball. He was also the owner of the Cincinnati Reds. So, here's a letter from a salesman to Gary Herman saying, you need to buy one of these. And I've been talking to McGraw, and he's telling me that we should send you this letter. I just think that's classic. I mean, anything to sell a lot. And then in January 17th, there was this advertising blitz throughout the U.S. They had ads in probably, I don't know the number, but in every major city there was an ad, and that's the one here on the right. And I think that just one comment from this. I believe that Pennant Park is the greatest combination I have ever managed. So McGraw, this copy is pretty much over the top, and he's trying to sell these lots as fast as he can. He also worked really hard to sort of build publicity around this. So McGraw, he and John Ringling, they paid Will Rogers, the famous humorist from the 20s, who may have been the most famous person, one of the most famous person in the U.S. in the 1920s, to come down and speak about Pennant Park and just about this area. So they paid Will Rogers to come down. McGraw was friends with Jimmy Walker. He had Jimmy Walker promise that he was going to come down later that summer and talk. B.F. Forbes, the industrialist publisher of Forbes magazine, he had Forbes come down and talk and do stuff. McGraw was working his contacts. McGraw was down there all the time. Essentially, between Thanksgiving and the end of February, McGraw was down there every week. And given how hard transportation was, that just must have been a lot of work. He was down there 12 times, essentially, over about a 14-week period. And, this was not, flying into Miami or Tampa, spending a couple of days and flying home. I mean, this was an ordeal. And he was really spending time to try and put this together. All right. Well, by February, it was clear that things were going a lot slower than they needed to go. The red in the middle are the actual sold lots, and you can see that you weren't even close to selling the kind of number of lots that you were going to need to sell. One commissions, you can just see that this is going on throughout Florida at the time. In October, there was $3 million in commissions at one brokerage house by an article in the paper. By February, that was down to 400,000. And so you can see that things are going the wrong way. On the right, there was another blitz ad in newspaper on February 15th. McGraw had changed his marketing team at this point. He brought in a different marketing group. The idea, it's unlikely that marketing was the issue. I mean, there was all sorts of issues, like building all of the roads and infrastructure out. But nevertheless, and you can see that this ad is much more desperate. So one of the lines is, buy 2 home sites in Pennant Park now, and later to sell 1 to finance your building operation. So it's buy 2. Don't just buy 1, buy 2. And then nothing can stop the migration to Florida. Year by year, your profits will go higher and higher. Start with the pioneer fortune makers. And then, perhaps one of the things that was going to get him in trouble later is he said, and part of this, I and my associates have all the money required to carry on the huge development program already underway. I do promise that every claim made for the property can be substantiated, and every promised investment will be an accomplished fact. And unfortunately, none of that was true. All right. So by April, Pennant Park here is in deep trouble. The land boom throughout Florida started collapsing in early 1925, excuse me, in early 1926. And Pennant Park was hit as hard as anything. There were just all of the people, it was basically sort of a Ponzi scheme. People would buy lots like I was talking about and then flip the contract. And then they would flip that contract. And then, of course, once there were no more buyers, the whole thing just collapsed. The first lawsuit against McGraw was filed in May for $14,000, which was a fairly small number. In August, McGraw started personally reimbursing people who had bought lots. He was not reimbursing his investors, but the people who bought lots and some of his investors, he started reimbursing at 50 cents on the dollar. Now, the papers gave him a lot of credit, saying, no one else in Florida was doing that. Only McGraw was doing it. But what happened is that McGraw had nobody else had. So, of course, this was all done through a corporate shell, and that worked. I mean, so there was really no liability through the corporate shell if this didn't work. But these ads were mail fraud for all that stuff, like I just mentioned. The comments that McGraw had that weren't true, that all constituted mail fraud. And I think there's little chance. I don't think McGraw ever saw these ads, right? I mean, he was down there every week trying to talk to people at the Chamber of Commerce and rich people in the area, and trying to get the people who were actually working and doing the little tiny bit that was doing roads. They were maybe spending $1,000 a week, so some nominal amount for a park of this massive size. And so he had no idea what was going on in these ads, but he was liable under the mail fraud laws for that kind of stuff. He was saying, like, I guarantee you that we're going to have all the infrastructure in. So more lawsuits quickly followed. And of course, Pennant Park went into bankruptcy and foreclosure. And, the investors in the park lost everything, and it went back to the previous owners. One of the sadder parts is that McGraw, that house on the right, Blanche McGraw was pretty much moved into the house and was really excited about that house and had talked about it in the papers, and they lost that house. I mean, that was right in Sarasota. It was right in the sort of the Golden Gate area. Sarasota was right on the water, servants' quarters, beautiful vista of the ocean or the bay looking out at Longboat Key. And he lost that house. He estimated the loss at about $100,000 of his money, which I think it was probably more. I mean, the amount of money that people put in and that he had to refund, and McGraw was a rich guy, but not at that level. I mean, he was just making a baseball salary of $40,000 to $50,000 a year, depending on sort of how he had a small profits interest in the Giants, and so this really crushed McGraw's finances. All right, so why the disaster? First of all, he was at least a year too late. The boom died in the beginning of 1925. If he had been able to put something together before that, it's still unlikely because of the total number of lots he had to sell, but it might not have been quite as big a fiasco. It just, even without the bust though, even without the land bust, just the number of lots he had, given the population of West Florida, plus the fact that this was completely raw, plus the fact that there was no real access to this thing. He was going to have to get roads from the Tamiami Trail or down from Cortez Boulevard. Even today, between the IMG Academy and the water, there's still scrubland, undeveloped scrubland. He had a naive trust in his partners, especially down in Florida. When McGraw was back in New York, there was no work getting done. He'd come down and sort of push everybody to start doing some work, and then maybe a little work would get done, and then he'd go back to New York, and people just sort of stopped doing anything. It's very strange. He obviously paid far too much for the site. He was close to $2 million into the site, and then you're going to have to do all the other costs. And he really didn't have anyone with deep pockets. There was no one running the project at the local level when McGraw wasn't there. A.B. Skinner, who was the marketing agent and the real estate agent, was really supposed to be helping him market it, but they were really just trying to flip lots and make real estate commissions, and were doing very little to try and actually get the thing developed. And then just as I mentioned, he was drastically undercapitalized if you were going to try and do this, $5 to $6 million kind of development. So McGraw never really rebounded. Again, as I mentioned, it's almost certain that he would have retired as manager. Frankie Frisch was talking about in that, that he believed Frisch, when someone said, are you going to take over as manager? Frisch said, well, I haven't heard that yet. I emphasized the yet. He also had been told by McGraw to go down and manage in the winter leagues to learn how to manage. So I think it's pretty clear, just given that he was going to move to Florida and run this thing, that he was going to give up managing. McGraw became excessively bitter towards his veteran players. I think a lot of you know the story of, Frankie Frisch in September. McGraw was so abusive to him during the year that, that Frisch jumped the team. And when he finally came back, McGraw was so unhappy with the whole thing that he traded him for Rogers Hornsby. But I mean, Frisch was sort of McGraw's protege, and the fact that, and McGraw just really turned on him harshly, much more harshly than previously in 1926. He released Irish Musil in September of 1926. He traded George Kelly after the year. I just, I think McGraw he just became really bitter because of this, and with some reason, although not necessarily to have the reason against, his veteran players. Opposing players mocked him for the development failure, and you can just imagine you have this regal John McGraw, and you have, some of the players, yelling at him, hey, Muggsy, can I buy a site in Pennant Park? You got any sites in Pennant Park for sale? And you can just imagine how that grated on him. And I don't know that this necessarily had to do with Pennant Park, but by the late 1920s, McGraw didn't really have the absolute control over the front office that he had previously. Charles Stoneham started acting a little more independent. Owner Charles Stoneham started taking over a little bit more of decision making. James Tierney, who was the secretary, started, acting a little bit as Stoneham's advisor. So there was just a lot going on here. And just to wrap this up, I would just say that, McGraw was a wealthy man, and he had visions of being even wealthier as the head honcho for this acclaimed development. Instead, he lost his life savings. Bill Coram, who was a young reporter at the time, wrote that 1926 was the last spring that McGraw was really himself. So it was a bitter event for John McGraw. That's what I got, Gary.
Dan,
Let me stop sharing.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Dan, it's incredible. You're talking about an event that very few people know about that happened 100 years ago, and your research is just unreal. I got a couple of questions for you. I don't know if I own a business, I wouldn't want my main guy doing anything but that business I was in. Wasn't Charles Stoneham, wasn't he upset that he should be managing the Giants and not worrying about another possible thing that he was into? I know he had partial, stuff with the Giants, but I'm still a little not understanding how the ownership didn't, put the foot down and say, look, you're the manager. If you want to go do business, you don't manage us anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true. And I think that that was mostly during the off season, right? I think that, this really started, he bought the land in November. He was probably looking at it during the year, the season of 1925. I mean, he was doing all kinds of foolish, right? He was also making a movie in 1925. John McGraw was. I'm with you on Stoneham. The only thing that I can think of is, Stoneham was having his own problems. He was indicted twice for various financial crimes. And, so he had his own sort of set of issues that he was dealing with. But I agree. It is pretty strange that Stoneham let this happen. And that's why I think too, that this was all part of McGraw was going to retire if this didn't work. And I'm blanking on it. It was one of his henchmen basically ran spring training for him in 1926. I think it was Brezhnev, and I can't believe I can't remember it, but I think it was Brezhnev who was running spring training for him in 1926. I mean, McGraw wasn't even really part of spring training.
I got one other question unrelated to this that maybe you know the answer. With the plaque that has been rededicated, there was a question that on the plaque it says 1904 World Series champs, and they did not participate. Did
Right.
John McGraw felt that the opposition was inferior? Is that what happened?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's hard to know whether it was John Brush, hated the American. John Brush, who owned the team at that time, hated the American League as much as McGraw did. I mean, McGraw hated Johnson. I mean, the two of them had this incredible enmity that lasted, you know, 30 years. I mean, until they both died. And so did Brush. I mean, Brush was the one of the holdouts when they had the peace settlement between the AL and the NL. So between the two of them, they just hated Ban Johnson. They hated the NL, they hated the AL. So I just think between the two of them, they just felt like the AL was still Bush League and they didn't agree with the peace settlement, and screw this.
Dan, thanks. We much success forward on your book.
Thank you.
Paul, you're up, Paul.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Dan. I had a question about this. Is really involves money. So if McGraw's making between 40,000 and 50,000 a year, what were his top players getting for salaries at this time?
Mid to high 20s.
Okay.
I'd
All
have to
right.
go back and double check that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and who were the people that actually bought those lots? And did they all lose their investment in their shirts?
Well, a lot of them were repaid by McGraw. I mean, that's part of that
Yeah.
$100,000 plus others. So the
Okay.
people who bought the lots generally got a lot of their money back through McGraw. But it was basically sort of celebrities. I should say this: the upper middle class in Florida. So the west coast of Florida, the Sarasota bankers, the Bradenton bankers. There was a judge in Virginia who was quoted later saying, I had my chauffeur, we tried to drive out to the site and we were just driving through these rutted lanes. So it was pretty much sort of upper middle class people on the west coast of Florida and then sort of throughout the Northeast and East Coast who, bought into the hype. And there weren't a whole lot of them. I mean, you can see by the red dots. I mean, I've never, unfortunately, the whole map, there was a map of the whole thing has been lost. And the Bradenton Public Library had had like two sections of a 16 section map. So it's hard to tell exactly what had been sold, but part of the problem is they just didn't sell that many.
There is a wonderful movie that the Marx Brothers made about the Florida land rush called The Coconuts. And it's really funny because the Marx Brothers were funny in everything they did. And the only other thing I just kind of wanted is that's something to kind of look at to get a feel for the period. The other thing I just wanted to mention, if Buster Posey had decided to do this investment somewhere in Florida, probably about half the people on this call would probably think about investing and going down there themselves. Thank you, Dan, very much.
No, thank you. And I would just say that some of the players did invest with him. It's hard to, I mean, if there's just sort of references in the press through like a Pegler or someone else column, but that he did get players to invest, which I think was part of what caused the angst later between him and some players.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Paul. Mars, you're up.
Thank you, Dan, for joining us. I've got a couple of questions and points that I would like you to elaborate on. Back about in the 1990s, on one of my pop's birthdays, I bought him Frank Graham's book, McGraw and the Giants, which seemed to be a definitive tale of John McGraw's managerial career with the team. I also knew that McGraw was a stockholder. I'd like to know if you know what percentage he owned with the team. I also want to mention that when I was working for MCI Telecommunications in San Francisco, I met a guy named Dwight Smith. His maternal grandfather was Francis McQuaid, who was a pal of McGraw's and part ownership. So, about what percentage of the team did McGraw own at any point? And also, I'd like to know about his interest in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Wasn't he interested in buying land there where Oni Madden, owner of the Cotton Club, had illegal gambling besides the therapeutic hot springs? Could you elaborate on those points?
Yeah, he and McQuaid each owned the same amount of shares of the Giants, and it was somewhere just south of 5% for each of them. When Stoneham bought the team in 1919, exactly how Stoneham found the team is a little bit. McQuaid claims that he introduced Stoneham to the Brush heirs. The team had been owned. John Brush had died, and Harry Hempstead, who was married to one of the Brush daughters, was the front man for the ownership, but there was two daughters and the widow owned the team. And there's a bunch of different stories about who introduced him, but McQuaid was somewhere in that mix, and he and McGraw then each got somewhere around, they each got about $50,000 worth of stock, and the team, they paid about $1 million for something around 63% of the team. I'd have to look it up. So he probably owned 5% of what Stoneham owned, and Stoneham probably owned somewhere around 63% of the team. There was still some other stockholders floating around there from the 1890s. The owners of the heirs of the Boston Braves actually had some small pieces of the Giants back from where, in the 1890s, all the owners sort of owned all parts of different teams. So he owned somewhere in the 3 to 5% range, and I could look it up. It's been a while since I did my stuff on the ownership.
What about Hot Springs,
he and
Arkansas?
McQuaid fell out later. So, as you
Hot
probably know.
Springs. What about
Hot Springs, I
Springs?
don't know. I mean, he went there once in a while. I don't think he was ever a big, McGraw spent a lot of time in California. I mean, he did he was Marlin, Texas, San Antonio, Texas. California was both before and after Texas. He was always in Cuba in the winter. I don't have a lot. I'd love to follow up with you. I don't have a whole lot of stuff of him in Hot Springs. I do in LA. I do in Cuba. I do in San Antonio. I do in Marlin, but not Hot Springs.
Because Babe Ruth barnstormed there, and McGraw had been there several times.
Yeah.
And didn't he have connections with Oni Madden of the Cotton Club?
He did. Yes, he did have connections with Oni Madden. I don't know though that he may have. I don't doubt that he had spent time in Hot Springs, but I don't think he had the kind of connection there that he had elsewhere.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Morris. David Lipman, you are up.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to see this presentation again because I judged it at SABR 53 in Dallas and I gave you very, very high marks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was outstanding. The main thing I wanted to do is I wanted to urge you to get in touch with Gary Mintz so that I think I mentioned to you at the time, my great uncle was the clubhouse boy in McGraw's clubhouse in the early 1900s, and then he was a bagman and enforcer for the legendary Arnold Rothstein. So I have a few memories of that I can share with you for
Great.
what little they're worth. I think I don't know if you shared it just now, but you did share with us at the time in Dallas what the land around Pennant Park looks like today. If you haven't, I think everybody here would be amused to know what became of that land plot.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the eastern side is the IMG Academy, the Nick Bollettieri tennis.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then the west, it's built out to the water between sort of the coast road and the water, but between Bollettieri and the coast road, it's just amazing to me. It's still scrubland and trees. It's just 100 plus years later, and all of Florida's built out except that little
The
area.
other question I would ask is in the courses is, have you stumbled on any other baseball figures who had the misfortune to lose their shirts in the Great Florida Land Swindle?
I don't know that people lost their shirts. A lot of people lost, a lot of people, a lot of them lost a lot of money. I'm just looking here because I'm just trying to remember who it was, and that's what happens when you do. Um, Yeah, so Washington first baseman Joe Judge lost a lot of money, and he basically, tongue in cheek, said, and a lot of them were buying. Walter Johnson lost a lot of money. I mean, a lot of them lost a lot of money. I don't know that it was sort of their life savings, but a lot of them did. And Joe Judge basically said, tongue in cheek, that he blamed Clark Griffith and the baseball owners for having them train in Florida so that they were going to see all of this. They were going to get encouraged by all these salespeople to buy all this land that wasn't going to be worth anything, and he wanted Clark Griffith to tongue-in-cheekly reimburse him.
Well, good luck with that, knowing Clark Griffith.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mr. Giant Sports Talk Live. Eric, you are up. You're muted, Eric.
There
Come on,
we
make
go.
believe you're on the air,
Yeah,
Eric. Let's go.
I know, man. Amateur move right there. Dan, thanks for that great presentation. Much appreciated. That's very well presented. How did you go about sourcing all of your material for doing this stuff? Because this is amazing. I mean, did you have to go in person to look up some of this stuff? A lot of it digitized? Because that's kind of where we're going now. A lot of things are being digitized. I'm just wondering the work that you had to do in doing this research. It must have been incredible to be able to find all these different sources to use for your project there.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is I think for a lot of us, I mean, that's part of the fun part of just doing research and trying to find new stuff in baseball. So yeah, no, I spent 2 days at the Manatee County Records Office, and there's like one guy there who just sort of mans the records office, and this stuff was all still in hard copy, and he knew where to go find these. The mortgage records are still there in hard copy, and he went and we dug out the mortgage records and the purchase agreements from hard copy on the Manatee County Records Office and made copies of them. So yeah, it was kind of cool to see that stuff, and you can probably no one's ever looked at it since 1925. The Hall of Fame has a lot of stuff, like the letter that I found, someone sending a note to Gary Herman. I've been through Gary Herman's papers at the Hall of Fame. The newspapers, with the amount of stuff that's digitized in the newspapers, if you just sort of spend a whole lot of time going through every paper and every hit from McGraw and Pennant Park that you can find, you can dig some stuff out. So
how about this? Now going into this, did you have already a preconceived idea of where you think this was going to go? And did anything doing your research, did you go, wow, I might have to take a little bit of a different direction than what I really wanted to do because of the information you were able to find?
Well, the one thing I'd still like to figure out is who all of his investors were. I mean, these were all underworld character. I should say that they were gamblers and people who were known into the papers to take bets. It was so guys like Whitey Beck. There's this whole group of New Yorkers in the 1920s that were gamblers, and they would sort of hang out with the upper class and then make bets for the upper class to the bookies. I mean, it was sort of this whole middleman thing. They were called betting commissioners. That's what they were called at the time. And I'm curious as to how many of them there were, and if they were really getting money, and if somehow they were getting money from some of the true, upper crust in New York. Because it wasn't, it was not the sort of the land barons of New York and that were investing with. It was much more of this sort of the movers and shakers on Broadway. I mean, he was buddies with George M. Cohen was an investor, right? I mean, it's just sort of this whole group of movers and shakers in New York. So I'd certainly love to understand how that all came together better.
That's incredible. And then a little counterfactual here. It's almost a blessing that it failed, because only a few years later, you had the market crash. Who knows what would have happened at that point in time. But again, thank you for that presentation. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Eric. Ed Freer, you're up. Ed, unmute, Ed. Come on, you're pulling an Eric. Let's go. There you go.
Hi, thanks again, Dan. I'm not a real estate expert in Florida, that's for sure. But I know that the East Coast seemed to develop a lot better than the West Coast. And many of that reasons, I think, was because of the Flaglers who were from New York and developing the railroad there. And did he have any connection with the Flaglers? Did he look? Why did he go to the West Coast rather than where a lot of the boom was on the East Coast, Palm Springs and everything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's because Foch and Howard hooked him up with the two fellas from Chicago who had the land, who knew that site. They had actually once been in ownership of that site, knew that site, and hooked McGraw up with that site. And I mean, the bust hit Miami as bad as anywhere else. I mean, the boom and bust was probably worse in Miami than it was on the West Coast. It was, I mean, Miami was just, there was, I mean, you know, you can take it for what it's worth, but in one of the articles, I was reading that one of the Miami newspapers in 1925 had more advertising pages than any newspaper in the world. And there was one edition of the Miami newspaper that was 540 pages, of which 520 of them were real estate ads. I mean, this is just kind of crazy. So yes, the East Coast was at least as crazy as the West Coast. It was more crazy than the West Coast. And how McGraw ended up here, I just think it was because that's where his relationships had the in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Mr. Frank Sexton, you are up, Frank.
Yeah, speaking about the East Coast, I mean, a lot of the land here was very locked up by developers who got here in the late teens and early 20s, people like George Merrick, who developed Coral Gables. But the thing about those booms is they were on their way to deflating by the end of 1925 because it was a true land bubble. They just couldn't keep selling at that rate. And a lot of Northerners would come down here. Don't forget, this was pre-air conditioning. You'd come down here, look around at this scruffy, sand-choked area, and it was hot. It's hot no matter what time of the year you go out there. And it doesn't look as attractive to you then as when you read about it in your paper in New York. Plus, you had the hurricane of 1926, which killed 300 people in Dade County. It absolutely destroyed Coral Gables. It was here for 17 hours. It was a Cat 5 hurricane. And that totally wiped out George Merrick. He never rebounded after that. It did a number on Miami Beach, too. So I think a lot of the Northerners would get down here and they saw what Mother Nature could be like down here in this lovely peninsula of ours. So I think all of these things contributed to the bust.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that the hurricane, I think the bust would have happened without the hurricane. I think that the bust had pretty much happened. And you're right. I mean, I think McGraw was hoping to be like George Merrick or Carl Fisher on Miami Beach, where he was going to be selling all these lots. And just as an aside for the East Coast, Williams Jennings Bryan was hired to
He was one of Merrick's salesmen.
Merrick's, yeah, exactly. To tout it. I mean, of all the people to tout real estate, right? I mean, it's just
he had a home on just off Brickell Avenue in Miami.
Thank you, Frank. Frank is, of course, our resident Floridian. Norm Coleman, you are up.
Hey, Dan, great presentation. Are you aware of any other land development fiascos during that period of time that was like this one?
I think that, yeah, there's a lot of them. Most of them are on the East Coast, but there's been books that have been there's books on the East on the Florida land bubble. I couldn't tell you the names of the people, but yes, there's many, not necessarily of this size, but like Coral Gables, sort of having its bubble burst. And yes, there were. I can't speak to them. I'm happy to dig them out of the books, but yes, there were quite a few others.
Okay, because I was curious as to whether this was the origin of the slogan. I've got some swampland in Florida to sell.
Yeah, again, that would have come from this time period. I think that, just as a complete aside, I think that there was certainly fraud. If you looked at, people were selling lots that didn't exist, that were out in the ocean or was in the swampland. But you didn't really have to resort to fraud to flip these contracts. I mean, you could make a whole lot of money just by being sort of mildly dishonest without actual fraud.
Oh, great. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Norm. Steve.
Yeah, I got a quick question for Ed and then a comment for Dan. Great presentation. Look forward to this book when it comes out. Ed, the Flagler, were they the Flagler Hotel up in the Catskills? Was that theirs?
From Dutchess County, and they developed the railroad going all the way down to Florida to Miami Beach.
You're not sure it was the Flagler Hotel up in LA?
Well, Flagler's the big hotel in Palm Beach too.
Okay, okay.
Flagler was originally from Ohio. He was an oil man. That's where he made his fortune. He
Okay.
started out as a partner of the Rockefellers and branched off from them.
Rockefellers were in Hudson Valley also.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dan, I'm a huge Al Jolson fan, and I know that Jolson was a close friend of McGraw's, but probably a lot smarter. So maybe he was not one of the investors. 1926 would have been a tough year for him anyway, but he had millions before anyone knew what millions were. And that was when they were starting to talk about the jazz singers. So Jolson spent a lot of time in California getting ready for the first talking picture. Do you have any references between the two of them? I know Jolson was at the Polo Grounds a lot. He was also friendly with the prize fighter Corbett. So, and I know he was a Giant fan, and I know he was a friend of McGraw's, but you mentioned everybody else besides him.
There's a lot of, like you say, there's references just that the two were, there'd be these listing of people, like McGraw was spending time with these people and Jolson would be one of them. But I've never found anything more specific than just that they were.
I'm not buying the book if Jolson's not in the index.
All right, we'll get him in there.
All right.
Does anybody have a question who does not know how to raise their yellow hand? Okay, I'm going to ask one last thing of Dan. Two things, actually. Dan, I love the name Pennant Park. Who came up with it? Was that the group talked about that, or McGraw?
I'm assuming it was McGraw's marketing agent, this A.B. Skinner, someone on the A.B. Skinner team. I don't know. I don't think it was McGraw. I just think it was someone on his marketing team. But McGraw loved, until it went down, he loved that term. He was always using the term Pennant Park.
That's a great play, great name. And the last thing, when you presented this to SABR, was the book something in your mind, or the how the audience reacted said, hey, you know what? Maybe I got something here.
So I'm going to give you the minute and a half answer instead of the 2-second answer, if that's okay.
Sure.
When the last book I did was in 2022, was a book on cheating in baseball, the interaction section of cheating and innovation. Gary, you were letting me on to talk about it, so thank you. But the genesis of that book is I was actually pitching a McGraw book to some publishers. And one of the publishers said, I don't think anybody wants to read a McGraw biography. He was too long ago. No one had ever heard of him. But this whole, the part of the sort of the underhanded stuff that he did, the cheating part, we'd be interested in that. So do you want to do a cheating book instead? There you go. Thank you, David.
No problem.
And so I recruited a friend, co-author Mark Armour, and we decided to do the cheating book. So I've been trying to figure out how to do a McGraw book for probably 10 years.
Get that book, by the way.
That's wonderful, Dan. And again, we wish you the best. Let's all give it up for Dan Levitt. Dan,
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I'm gonna ask you something now. We're not gonna give you a date or anything, but roughly September 25th, the Merkel Boner. I know you wrote something about it. Maybe next year you come back and talk about it.
There's a whole lot about that I think is sort of undersold at this point, or just, obviously it's all out there, but there's a lot. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff about that is not fully talked about. So I'd love to come back.
Wonderful, because we know what a great research you are. So let's all give it up for Dan Levitt.
I hope Dan has read Carl Hyacin about his Tales of Florida.
I have read some of his mysteries, but not too many.
All right, we are going to we're gonna wrap it up here again for all those who celebrate Happy New Year, and we will reconvene next Thursday. Should be a really interesting show with Tom Ross and his renderings. He's very famous artist, renderings of Willie Mays' The Catch that he had at the Polo Grounds. So until then, I am going to stop recording. And if anybody wants to talk a little giant baseball for a while, we're good to go. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next Thursday.